Mountain biker's worst nightmare turns to bright side thanks to strange dog. Tom stood at the edge of the trailhead, the crisp morning air biting at his exposed skin. He zipped his cycling jacket a little higher, the familiar rustle of the fabric a comforting sound in the pre-dawn quiet. Before him, the mountain loomed, a dark, silent giant against the lightening sky. It was a familiar sight, a challenge he'd faced countless times, but today, there was an edge to the anticipation, a nervous flutter in his stomach. This wasn't just another ride. This was the Devil's Descent, a grueling, invitation-only event that pushed even seasoned riders to their limits. Tom wasn't a young man anymore. At 52, the years were starting to show, not in his spirit, but in the subtle aches and twinges that reminded him he wasn't invincible. But he refused to let age define him. He'd been mountain biking for over 30 years, ever since he'd first discovered the thrill of conquering a steep incline, the adrenaline rush of a fast descent. It was more than just a hobby. It was a part of who he was. He glanced at his watch, almost time. He'd spent the last few weeks meticulously preparing, checking his equipment, studying the course maps, visualizing every twist and turn. He knew this trail like the back of his hand, or so he thought. The Devil's Descent was notorious for its unpredictable terrain, its sudden drops, and its treacherous rock gardens. It was a test of skill, endurance, and mental fortitude. His wife, Sarah, had tried to dissuade him, her voice laced with concern. "Tom, are you sure about this? It's so dangerous." He'd brushed her concerns aside, telling her it was just another ride, but he knew she was right to worry. He'd had a few close calls over the years, a broken collarbone once, a nasty concussion another time. He'd always bounced back, but Sarah's ray lingered, a quiet undercurrent to his excitement. He thought about Sarah now, picturing her in their cozy cabin, probably still asleep. They'd been together since college, two vastly different people drawn together by an inexplicable magnetism. She was an artist, vibrant and expressive, her world filled with colors and emotions. He was a software engineer, logical and reserved, finding solace in the quiet solitude of nature. They were an unlikely pair, but their differences somehow complemented each other, creating a balance that had sustained them for over 30 years. He knew Sarah loved him, but sometimes he wondered if she truly understood his passion for mountain biking. It wasn't just about the adrenaline rush, it was about something deeper, something primal. It was about connecting with nature, pushing himself to his limits, feeling truly alive. It was about escaping the mundane routines of everyday life and finding a sense of freedom in the vastness of the wilderness. The other riders were starting to gather now, their voices echoing in the stillness of the morning. Tom recognized a few familiar faces, fellow adrenaline junkies, men and women who shared his love for the sport. There was a sense of camaraderie among them, a shared understanding of the risks they were taking, the challenges they were about to face. He checked his bike one last time, making sure everything was in order. He tightened his helmet strap, adjusted his gloves, and took a deep breath. The sun was starting to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The mountain was calling. It was time to ride. The starting horn blared, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the morning stillness. Tom pushed off, his legs pumping, his bike surging forward. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, the thrill of the race. He weaved through the pack of riders, his tires spitting gravel, his heart pounding in his chest. The first part of the trail was relatively easy, a wide, well-maintained path that wound its way through the lower slopes of the mountain. But Tom knew this was just the warm-up. The real challenge lay ahead, in the treacherous upper reaches of the mountain, where the trail narrowed, the incline steepened, and the terrain became unforgiving. He focused on his breathing, trying to maintain a steady rhythm. He glanced at his competitors, a mix of seasoned veterans and eager newcomers. There was a fierce determination in their eyes, a hunger for victory. But Tom wasn't racing against them. He was racing against himself, against his own limitations, against the mountain itself. The trail began to climb, the incline gradually increasing. Tom shifted gears, his muscles burning, his lungs working overtime. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, the cool morning air offering little relief. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead, navigating the twists and turns, avoiding the roots that threatened to send him tumbling. The forest closed in around him, the trees forming a dense canopy overhead. The air grew cooler, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in dappled patterns. He could hear the birds singing, the wind rustling through the branches, the distant murmur of a stream. He felt a sense of peace, a connection to the natural world. This was why he loved mountain biking. This feeling of being immersed in nature, of being a part of something larger than himself. He reached the first checkpoint, a small clearing where volunteers were handing out water and snacks. He grabbed a quick drink, then pushed on, eager to tackle the next section of the trail. He knew the hardest part was yet to come, the infamous Devil's Staircase, a series of steep, rocky switchbacks that tested even the most experienced riders. He approached the staircase with caution, his heart pounding in his chest. He could see the other riders ahead of him, their bikes bobbing and weaving as they navigated the treacherous terrain. He took a deep breath, then launched himself into the first switchback. His bike bounced and rattled, his tires struggling for grip. He leaned into the turn, his body a counterbalance to the centrifugal force. He felt a surge of adrenaline, a thrill of conquering the challenge. He cleared the first switchback, then the next, and the next. He was in the zone now, his mind and body working in perfect harmony. He felt a sense of exhilaration, a feeling of being unstoppable. But he knew he couldn't let his guard down. One mistake, one lapse in concentration, could send him tumbling down the mountainside. He reached the top of the staircase, his lungs burning, his legs screaming. He paused for a moment, catching his breath, taking in the breathtaking view. He could see the valley spread out below him, a patchwork of green fields and winding rivers. He felt a sense of accomplishment, a sense of pride. He'd conquered the Devil's Staircase. But he knew the race wasn't over yet. There were still miles to go. And the most dangerous part of the trail lay ahead. Tom pushed off from the summit of the Devil's Staircase, the exhilaration of the climb still coursing through his veins. The trail ahead snaked along the ridge, a narrow ribbon of dirt clinging precariously to the mountainside. The drop-off to the left was sheer, a dizzying plunge into the valley below. He kept his eyes focused on the trail, his hands gripping the handlebars tightly. The wind picked up, whipping at his face, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The sun was high now, beating down on him, but the air was still cool and crisp. He felt a sense of euphoria, a feeling of being on top of the world. He was in his element, doing what he loved, pushing himself to his limits. He rounded a bend, the trail dipping suddenly, then rising again in a sharp incline. He shifted gears, his legs straining, his muscles burning. He could feel the lactic acid building up, his body starting to protest. But he pushed through the pain, determined to reach the next checkpoint. He reached the crest of the hill, the trail leveling out for a brief stretch. He took a moment to catch his breath, glancing around at the stunning scenery. The mountains stretched out before him, a vast, undulating landscape of green and gray. He felt a sense of awe, a feeling of being insignificant in the face of such grandeur. He started to descend, the trail winding its way through a dense forest. The trees formed a dark tunnel around him, the sunlight filtering through the leaves in patches. He picked up speed, the wind whistling in his ears. He felt a sense of freedom, a feeling of being unbound by gravity, of flying through the air. Suddenly, without warning, the ground gave way beneath him. He'd hit a patch of loose gravel hidden beneath a thin layer of dirt. His front tire slipped, sending his bike veering off course. He tried to regain control, but it was too late. His bike hit a large rock, the impact sending him flying through the air. He landed hard, his body slamming against the ground. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his leg, a sickening crunch. He lay there for a moment, stunned, his breath knocked out of him. He tried to move, but his leg wouldn't respond. He felt a wave of panic wash over him. He looked around, trying to get his bearings. He was surrounded by trees, the trail nowhere in sight. He was alone, injured, and lost. He tried to stand, but his leg buckled beneath him. He fell to the ground, the pain in his leg intensifying. He checked his leg. It was twisted at an unnatural angle. He knew immediately that it was broken. He felt a wave of nausea, his stomach churning. He tried to reach for his phone, but it was gone, lost in the crash. He was completely cut off. No way to call for help. He lay there, helpless, his mind racing. He thought about Sarah, her worried face, her words of caution. He thought about his children, his friends, his life. He thought about all the things he'd never get to do, the places he'd never get to see. He felt a wave of despair wash over him, a feeling of hopelessness. He knew he had to stay calm, had to think clearly. Panic wouldn't help him. He took a deep breath, trying to control his fear. He knew he had to find a way to get help, but he didn't know how. He was alone, injured, and lost in the wilderness. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The temperature was dropping, the air growing colder. He knew he was in serious trouble. Nightfall descended on the mountain, casting long, eerie shadows through the trees. The temperature plummeted, the once pleasant breeze turning into a biting wind that seemed to slice through Tom's thin cycling gear. He shivered uncontrollably, his teeth chattering, his broken leg throbbing with a dull, persistent ache. Panic gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. He was alone, injured, and utterly vulnerable. The reality of his situation hit him with the force of a physical blow. No phone, no signal, no way to call for help. He was stranded in the heart of the wilderness, at the mercy of the elements and his own dwindling strength. He tried to assess his situation. He was lying in a small clearing, surrounded by a thick stand of pine trees. The dense foliage blocked out most of the moonlight, making it difficult to see. He could hear the wind whistling through the branches, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. The sounds, once familiar and comforting, now seemed ominous, filled with unseen threats. He tried to move, to find a more sheltered spot, but the pain in his leg was excruciating. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to crawl, dragging his injured leg behind him like a dead weight. Every inch was in agony, but he knew he couldn't stay where he was. He needed to find shelter, to protect himself from the cold. He spotted a large fallen log, its trunk partially hollowed out. He crawled towards it, his arms aching, his body trembling with exhaustion. He managed to pull himself inside the hollow, the damp earth offering a meager comfort against the cold. He curled up in a fetal position, trying to conserve body heat. His mind raced, replaying the events of the day, the thrill of the race, the suddenness of the crash, the sickening crunch of his leg. He berated himself for his recklessness, for ignoring Sarah's warnings. He should have known better than to push himself so hard, to take such risks. Now, he was paying the price. He thought about Sarah, her face etched with worry, her voice filled with love and concern. He imagined her waiting for him at the finish line, her smile fading as the hours passed, her worry turning to fear. He closed his eyes, tears welling up. He had to get back to her, had to let her know he was alive. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind plagued by nightmares. He saw himself falling endlessly into a dark abyss, his screams echoing in the void. He saw Sarah's face, her eyes filled with sadness, her voice whispering his name. He woke up with a start, his heart pounding, his body drenched in sweat. He looked around, disoriented. The moon had risen higher, casting a pale light into the clearing. He could see the outline of the trees, the shadows dancing in the breeze. He felt a surge of hope. He was still alive. He still had a chance. He knew he couldn't give up. He had to find a way to survive, to get back to Sarah. He had to believe that someone would find him, that help would come. He clung to that hope, a fragile lifeline in the face of despair. The first rays of dawn painted the sky with streaks of pink and gold, a stark contrast to the darkness that had enveloped the mountain. Tom awoke stiff and cold, his body aching, his leg throbbing with a renewed intensity. The damp earth clung to his clothes, and a chill permeated his bones. He was weak, dehydrated, and his hope was dwindling with each passing moment. He tried to sit up, but the pain in his leg was unbearable. He cried out, a sound lost in the vastness of the wilderness. He knew he couldn't stay where he was. He needed to find water, find food, to find a way to signal for help. But he was trapped, a prisoner of his own broken body. As he lay there, his eyes scanning the forest floor, he noticed a movement in the periphery of his vision. A shadow detached itself from the trees, moving silently, cautiously. He tensed, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew it was there, watching him. A moment later, a dog emerged from the trees. It was a medium-sized dog, its fur a mix of brown and gray, its eyes intelligent and alert. It looked at Tom, its head tilted slightly, as if assessing him. Tom stared back, his mind racing. He'd heard stories of wild animals in the mountains, bears, mountain lions, coyotes. He wasn't sure what this dog was, but he knew it could be dangerous. The dog took a tentative step forward, then another. It didn't bark, didn't growl, just watched him with its intelligent eyes. Tom held his breath, afraid to move, afraid to make a sound. He wasn't sure what to expect. The dog stopped a few feet away, its tail wagging tentatively. It lowered its head, as if offering a gesture of peace. Tom was surprised. He'd expected aggression, hostility, but this dog seemed curious, even friendly. He watched the dog closely, trying to discern its intentions. It didn't look like a wild animal. It looked lost, perhaps even injured. He noticed a slight limp in its gait. He felt a flicker of empathy for the creature. They were both alone, both vulnerable, both in need of help. He spoke to the dog in a soft voice, trying to reassure it. "It's okay," he whispered. "I won't hurt you." The dog seemed to respond to his voice, its tail wagging a little faster now. It took another step forward, then another, until it was standing right beside him. It sniffed at his hand, then licked it gently. Tom was surprised by the gesture of affection. He reached out and stroked the dog's fur. It was rough and matted, but it felt warm and comforting. He looked into the dog's eyes, and he saw something there, something that surprised him. He saw intelligence, compassion, a sense of understanding. He felt a connection to the animal, a sense of shared vulnerability. They were both alone, both lost, both in need of help. Perhaps, he thought, they could help each other. The dog, sensing Tom's fear had subsided, nudged his hand with its head, a gentle, insistent gesture. Tom stroked the dog's rough fur, a sense of calm washing over him. He wasn't sure why this creature had approached him, but its presence was a comfort, a welcome break from the crushing loneliness he'd endured through the night. He noticed the dog's ribs were visible beneath its matted coat, a clear sign of malnourishment. He felt a pang of sympathy. They were both in need of sustenance. He reached into his cycling jersey, finding the remains of a protein bar he'd packed for the race. He broke off a small piece and offered it to the dog. The dog sniffed it cautiously, then took it in its mouth, devouring it in a few bites. Tom smiled. "Hungry, huh?" he murmured. The dog wagged its tail in response. He shared the rest of the protein bar with the dog, dividing it equally. It wasn't much, but it was something. They ate in silence, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. As the morning wore on, Tom and the dog stayed close to each other. The dog seemed to sense Tom's weakness, staying by his side, offering silent companionship. Tom began to feel a connection to the animal, a sense of shared vulnerability. They were both lost, both injured, both in need of help. They were an unlikely alliance, bound together by circumstance and a shared struggle for survival. He noticed the dog kept looking towards the trees, its ears perked, as if listening for something. Tom wondered if the dog was trying to find its way home, or perhaps searching for food or water. He decided to follow the dog's lead, hoping it knew the area better than he did. He tried to stand, but his leg buckled beneath him. He cried out in pain, collapsing back to the ground. The dog whined, nudging his leg gently. Tom realized he couldn't move without help. He was trapped. He looked at the dog, an idea forming in his mind. He couldn't walk, but maybe the dog could. Maybe the dog could find help, could lead someone back to him. It was a long shot, but it was his only hope. He pointed towards the trail, then towards the valley below. "Go," he said, his voice hoarse. "Find help. Get help." The dog looked at him, its eyes intelligent and understanding. It seemed to understand what he was asking. It wagged its tail, then took a few steps towards the trail. It stopped, looked back at Tom, then turned and disappeared into the trees. Tom watched it go, a mixture of hope and fear swirling inside him. He wasn't sure if the dog would come back, if it could even find its way back, but he had to trust it. He had to believe that it would help him. He lay there, alone again, but this time, he wasn't as afraid. He had a glimmer of hope, a fragile lifeline in the vast wilderness. He had an unlikely ally, a furry guardian angel, and he believed that it would come back for him. He had to believe. Hours crawled by. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting its relentless heat upon the forest floor. Tom's thirst intensified, his throat parched and raw. He tried to conserve his energy, lying still in the shade of the fallen log, his eyes closed, his mind drifting. He thought of Sarah, her gentle touch, her warm smile. He imagined her holding him, comforting him, telling him everything would be all right. He opened his eyes, the image of Sarah fading as quickly as it had appeared. He was alone. The dog hadn't returned. Doubt crept into his mind, whispering insidious thoughts of abandonment and despair. Had he been foolish to trust the animal? Was he truly alone in this vast wilderness, destined to die a slow, agonizing death? Just as his hope began to dwindle, he heard a sound, a faint rustling in the undergrowth, a soft patting of paws on the dry leaves. He held his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. Could it be? The dog emerged from the trees, its tongue lolling, its tail wagging furiously. Tom's heart leaped with joy. He wasn't alone. The dog had come back, but the dog wasn't alone. Trailing behind it, a man emerged from the trees. He was tall and rugged, with a weathered face and kind eyes. He was dressed in hiking gear, a backpack slung over his shoulders. He looked at Tom with concern. "Are you all right?" the man asked, his voice rough but gentle. Tom tried to speak, but his voice was a croak. He nodded weakly. "Don't worry," the man said. "We're here to help you." He knelt beside Tom, examining his injured leg. "Looks like a bad break," he said. "We need to get you out of here." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a first aid kit. He cleaned and bandaged Tom's leg, his touch gentle and reassuring. Tom winced in pain, but he was grateful for the man's help. "My name's Jake," the man said. "I'm a park ranger. This little fella here led me to you." He gestured towards the dog, who was now sitting beside Tom, its head resting on his lap. Tom looked at the dog, his eyes filled with gratitude. He reached out and stroked its fur. "Thank you," he whispered. "You saved my life." The dog licked his hand in response. Jake explained that he'd been patrolling the trails when he'd encountered the dog. The dog had been acting strangely, barking and pulling at his pants, trying to lead him in a particular direction. Jake had followed the dog, curious to see what it was so excited about. He'd been surprised to find Tom, injured and alone, in the middle of the wilderness. "You're lucky this little fella found you," Jake said. "He's a real hero." Tom nodded, his heart filled with gratitude. He knew he owed his life to the dog, this unlikely guardian angel who had appeared out of nowhere. He looked at the dog, his eyes filled with affection. He knew he would never forget this animal, this loyal companion who had saved him from despair. The dog's bark pierced the silence of the forest, a shrill sound that echoed through the trees. Tom's heart leaped with hope. He knew that the dog was trying to signal for help. He tried to call out, but his voice was too weak. He could only watch as the dog disappeared into the undergrowth. Minutes later, a helicopter roared overhead, its powerful engines drowning out the sound of the wind. Tom's heart pounded with excitement. Help was on the way. The helicopter landed in a small clearing, its rotors churning up dust and debris. A group of rescuers emerged from the helicopter, their faces drawn with concern. They saw Tom lying on the ground, his leg bandaged and his face pale. They rushed to his side, offering him water and blankets. Tom was overwhelmed with relief. He was safe, surrounded by people who could help him. He felt a wave of gratitude wash over him, a gratitude that extended to the dog, the unlikely hero who had saved his life. He was taken to the hospital, where he underwent surgery on his broken leg. The recovery was long and arduous, but Tom was determined to get back on his feet. He had a new lease on life, a second chance, thanks to the dog. He returned to the wilderness, the scene of his accident, but this time with a different perspective. He saw the beauty of the forest, the resilience of nature, the interconnectedness of all living things. He felt a sense of peace, a sense of belonging. He never forgot the dog, the loyal companion who had saved his life. He adopted the dog, naming him Lucky. They became inseparable, a testament to the power of friendship and the unwavering loyalty of animals. Tom's story spread, a tale of survival, courage, and the enduring bond between man and beast. It inspired people around the world, reminding them of the power of hope, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unexpected ways in which we can be saved. The rhythmic whir of the helicopter blades faded as Tom was gently lifted onto a stretcher and loaded inside. The world tilted, a dizzying mix of sky and treetops. Before righting itself as they ascended, he closed his eyes, a wave of exhaustion washing over him. The adrenaline that had sustained him for so long was finally wearing off, leaving him drained and weak. He felt a gentle nudge against his hand. Lucky, surprisingly, was there, nestled beside him, his warm fur a comforting presence. He managed a weak smile, a silent thank you to his furry savior. The flight back to civilization was a blur. Tom drifted in and out of consciousness, images of the accident, the dog, and Sarah flashing through his mind. He remembered the fear, the pain, the loneliness, but he also remembered the dog's unwavering loyalty, its gentle nudges, its reassuring presence. Lucky had been more than just a companion. He'd been his lifeline. He awoke to the bustle of the hospital emergency room. Doctors and nurses swarmed around him, their voices a mix of concern and efficiency. He felt a sharp prick in his arm as they started an IV drip. He tried to speak, to ask about Lucky, but his voice failed him. He squeezed his eyes shut, a wave of anxiety washing over him. What if they'd taken Lucky away? What if he never saw him again? A gentle lick on his cheek brought him back to reality. Lucky was there, lying calmly beside him, his tail thumping softly against the crisp white sheets. Relief washed over him. He wasn't alone. The next few days were a whirlwind of medical procedures, tests, and consultations. His leg was indeed broken, a clean fracture that would require surgery and a long recovery period. The doctors explained the procedure, the risks, the rehabilitation process. Tom listened, his mind focused on one thing, getting back on his feet. Sarah arrived at the hospital shortly after he did. Her face was etched with worry, her eyes red and swollen. But when she saw him, when she saw Lucky by his side, her face softened, a flicker of relief replacing the fear. She rushed to his side, embracing him gently, careful not to jostle his injured leg. "Tom," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I was so worried." He squeezed her hand, his heart filled with love and gratitude. He was alive, he was safe, and he was with Sarah. That was all that mattered. Sarah stayed by his side throughout his hospital stay, her presence a constant source of comfort and support. She brought him books, magazines, anything to distract him from the pain and the boredom. She told him stories about their children, about their friends, about the world outside the hospital walls. She reminded him of all the things he had to look forward to, all the reasons he had to get better. And Lucky was always there, a silent guardian, a furry friend. He slept at the foot of his bed, his presence a constant reminder of the incredible bond they had forged in the wilderness. He was a symbol of hope, a testament to the power of connection, and a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a glimmer of light. The day Tom was discharged from the hospital was a celebration, not a grand boisterous party, but a quiet, heartfelt gathering of family and close friends. Sarah had transformed their living room into a cozy haven, complete with soft blankets, comfortable pillows, and a ramp leading up to the front door, making it easier for Tom to navigate with his crutches. But the real star of the show was Lucky. He bounded around the room, his tail wagging furiously, greeting each guest with enthusiastic licks and playful nudges. He seemed to understand that this was a special day, a day of homecoming, a day of reunion. Tom watched Lucky, a warm smile spreading across his face. He couldn't imagine his life without the dog now. Lucky wasn't just a pet, he was family. He was a reminder of Tom's ordeal, a symbol of his resilience, and a testament to the extraordinary bond they had forged in the wilderness. The process of adopting Lucky had been surprisingly smooth. Sarah had contacted the local animal shelter, explaining the incredible story of how the dog had saved Tom's life. The shelter staff were touched by the tale and readily agreed to release Lucky to Tom's care. They even waived the adoption fee, calling it a hero's adoption. Life at home settled into a new rhythm. Tom's days were filled with physical therapy sessions, designed to strengthen his leg and restore his mobility. The exercises were painful and frustrating, but Tom persevered, driven by his desire to return to the trails, to reclaim his life. Lucky was his constant companion, offering unwavering support and unconditional love. He'd lie patiently by Tom's side during his therapy sessions, offering a comforting presence. He'd accompany Tom on short walks around the neighborhood, his gentle nudges a silent encouragement. He'd even sleep at the foot of Tom's bed, his soft snores a soothing lullaby. The bond between Tom and Lucky deepened with each passing day. They communicated without words, a shared understanding passing between them through a glance, a touch, a shared moment of quiet companionship. Lucky seemed to anticipate Tom's needs, offering comfort when he was in pain, joy when he was feeling down, and unwavering loyalty always. Tom learned about Lucky's past. He'd been found wandering the streets, malnourished and neglected. He'd clearly been through a lot, but his spirit remained unbroken. He was a survivor. Just like Tom. Tom felt a profound sense of gratitude for Lucky. The dog had not only saved his life, he had given him a new perspective, a new appreciation for the simple things in life. He had shown him the power of unconditional love, the importance of connection, and the resilience of the spirit. He knew he would never be able to fully repay Lucky for what he had done, but he could give him a loving home, a safe haven, and a lifetime of companionship. He could show him the same loyalty and devotion that Lucky had shown him. He could give him a life filled with love, laughter, and endless belly rubs. He could give him a forever home. Tom's story spread, a tale of survival, courage, and the enduring bond between man and beast. It was featured in newspapers, on television, and even in a book. His name became synonymous with resilience and determination. He was invited to speak at schools and community events, sharing his story with others, inspiring them to never give up on their dreams, to never lose hope, and to cherish the bonds of love and friendship. Lucky, too, became a celebrity. He was featured in magazine articles and even appeared on a television show. He was a beloved mascot, a symbol of hope and resilience. He traveled with Tom to various events, spreading his message of love and compassion. Tom and Lucky's story touched the hearts of millions. It reminded people of the power of the human spirit, the importance of friendship, and unwavering loyalty of animals. It gave people hope in a world often filled with darkness and despair. Tom and Lucky continued to live happily together, their bond stronger than ever. They were a living testament to the power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the extraordinary ways in which life can surprise us.